This is a compilation of some videos scheduled for the year 2022 for the Philosophers in Their Own Words playlist. These videos are about the essay, Is Life Worth Living? By William James. I'm airing the compilation early in February 2021 because suicide rates are up lately. Maybe someone out there needs James' arguments that your life is indeed worth living. If that's you, I hope they help. There's more that helps. Some things that help are better than William James. If you need help, get help. And if you want to talk to a Christian philosopher, feel free to email me at platoandaugustine@gmail.com. Without further ado, let's go to William James. Is life worth living? This is the title and the topic of another essay in The Will to Believe and Other Essays by William James. It's a lovely piece of philosophical writing. It was probably a lovely speech when he originally gave it. It goes back to the 1890s. It was initially an address to the Harvard Young Men's Christian Association. Now, the text is a defense of continuing to live. It's an objection to suicide. It is an argument that suicide is a bad idea. But it is also a presentation of the major ideas of that more famous essay, The Will to Believe. It's entirely possible that had history just gone just a little bit differently, we would have been reading this one instead of The Will to Believe. It covers a whole lot of the same territory. Anyway, is life worth living? Let's look at the text. This will probably take more than one video. Let's go initially to, skip all the opening material. Section 1 of the text. That life is not worth living, the whole army of suicides declare. An army whose roll call, like the famous evening gun of the British Army, follows the sun round the world and never terminates. We too, as we sit here in our comfort, must ponder these things also, for we are of one substance with these suicides, and their life is the life we share. Many people have testified that life is not worth living, and confirmed that that was their testimony by killing themselves. Beginning of section 2. To come immediately to the heart of my theme, then, what I propose is to imagine ourselves reasoning with a fellow mortal who is on such terms with life that the only comfort left to him is to brood on the assurance, you may end it when you will. What reasons can we plead that we may render such a brother or sister willing to take up the burden again? Let us suppose that we are reasoning with someone who thinks life is not worth living, who is contemplating suicide, and whose only comfort in life is that he can end it whenever he so chooses. James is going to try to give reasons against suicide that would there'd be good reasons for giving to such a person. Skipping a couple of paragraphs on the importance of the question, which is interesting. He mentions in the United States about 3,000 suicides every year. That's statistics from the 1890s. I have no idea what the statistics are these days. I imagine they're quite a bit larger. Let me say immediately, I have no idea if the percentages are larger, but the raw numbers I'm sure are much larger today. Let me say immediately, section 2, second paragraph of section 2. Let me say immediately that my final appeal is to nothing more recondite than religious faith. So far as my argument is to be destructive, it will consist in nothing more than the sweeping away of certain views that often keep the springs of religious faith compressed. And so far as it is to be constructive, it will consist in holding up to the light of day certain considerations calculated to let loose these springs in a normal, natural way. Pessimism is essentially a religious disease. In the form of it to which you are most liable, it consists in nothing but a religious demand to which there comes no normal religious reply. The final appeal, the final argument, the main argument he's going to make against suicide is going to be a defense of religion. It's going to be an appeal to religious faith. The destructive, the critical point, the critical aspect of his analysis is going to consist in merely the sweeping away of certain views that often keep the springs of religious faith compressed. The constructive part of his argument, where he doesn't critique or object to something, but where he tries to build up his own position, will consist in holding up to the light of day certain considerations calculated to let loose these springs in a normal, natural way. There is, within the human heart, a certain religious impulse. And James thinks this is perfectly healthy. This is perfectly proper. And there are certain things that block it. Certain certain views that often keep the springs of religious faith compressed. And James is going to critique those and then hold up to the light of day certain considerations which are calculated to let loose these springs in a normal, natural way. Pessimism is essentially a religious disease. It is a religious demand to which there comes no normal religious reply. Now, what does that mean? Let's go to the next paragraph. No, 2 paragraphs down. That is why I call pessimism an essentially religious disease. The nightmare view of life has plenty of organic sources. That is to say, people who think life is not worth living, life is a living nightmare, a waking nightmare. These people may have any number of biological causes for their state of mind. But the nightmare view of life does not merely have organic biological sources. Its great reflective source. It has a source in our ideas. The view that life is not worth living has a source in our ideas, not just in our physical condition. Its great reflective source has at all times been the source of depression, the source of thinking that life is not worth living, has, on the idea side of its causes, always had the contradiction between the phenomena of nature and the craving of the heart to believe that behind nature there is a spirit whose expression nature is. There has been a contradiction between the facts we observe in the world and the craving of the heart to believe that behind all these facts there is a spirit whose expression nature is. That there is some sort of higher power who is behind all these facts. It does seem that there is a contradiction between the facts of life, which are often quite painful and miserable, and the idea that they are expressing the will of some divine spirit. This inner discord can be relieved in either of 2 ways. The longing to read the facts religiously may cease and leave the bare facts by themselves, or supplementary facts may be discovered or believed in which permit the religious reading to go on. These 2 ways of relief are the 2 stages of recovery, the 2 levels of escape from pessimism. And that was section 2. In section 3, he's going to go with the first way. So let's review and summarize and set ourselves up for the next video, if all goes well. The suicidal view of life. Life is not worth living. This kind of pessimism, James says, has, to be sure, its organic causes. He seems to enjoy this joke. Is life worth living? It depends on the liver. A stupid pun on the condition of your body, with the liver as a particular sample of one bodily organ whose condition may affect quality of life. But also, of course, it depends on the liver. It depends on who's asking. What was I talking about? The nightmare view of life. The nightmare view of life does have organic causes, biological causes, but it also has a reflective cause, a cause in our thoughts, a cause in our ideas. And that cause, James says, is the conflict between one thing, our desire to view the world religiously, our desire to think that behind the facts of the world there is some divine power, some divine spirit, some sort of God whose will is being carried out in these facts. And, on the other hand, our observation of the facts themselves. On the one hand, that religious impulse, and on the other hand, the observation of the facts themselves. That's a problem. That is what produces this despair. And James says one solution is to just forget the religious longing and just deal with the facts themselves. And in section 3, he gives an interesting analysis of how, even just dealing with the facts themselves, you can make a case against suicide. But that is of somewhat less interest to me, and I put it in context. You can go find the text. It should be easily available online. It's public domain material. Section 3 of his Life Worth Living is where he's going to give that analysis. The analysis of just observing the facts of the world and finding in them a case against suicide without this appeal to the propriety of this religious belief that there is in fact some higher power whose cause makes life worth living. That is the second and the primary argument, and we will come to it in the next video. Returning to the essay, Is Life Worth Living? In The Will to Believe and Other Essays by William James. By the way, if you're looking at the title, this says The Will to Believe and Other Essays in Popular Philosophy, Human Immortality, both books bound as one. That is to say, this particular edition has some extra words on the cover because it also has an extra short book, his little analysis of human immortality and some supposed objections to the doctrine of life after death, his refutation of them. So if you're looking at the title and thinking, what are these other words? And he keeps using, what are these other words he's not using? Well, the words I'm not using are the title of the other volume included, the other book included in this edition. But as far as I'm currently planning, I'm not going to do the second book. I just plan to go through The Will to Believe and other essays. Anyway, is life worth living? Section 4. And now, in turning to what religion may have to say to the question, I come to what is the soul of my discourse. Religion has meant many things in human history, but when from now on when I use the word, I mean to use it in the supernaturalist sense, as declaring that, here's now his working definition of religion in this text, that the so-called order of nature, which constitutes this world's experience, is only one portion of the total universe, and that there stretches beyond this visible world an unseen world, of which we now know nothing positive, but in its relation to which the true significance of our present mundane life consists. A man's religious faith, whatever more special items of doctrine it may involve, means for me essentially his faith in the existence of an unseen order of some kind in which the riddles of the natural order may be found explained. Now this definition is to be read in comparison, possibly in contrast, mostly comparison, with his other definition that you may have seen on an earlier video. In The Will to Believe, he says, religion, science says things are, morality says some things are better than other things, or would be better if they were brought into reality. And religion says essentially two things. The better things are the more eternal things, and we're better off even now if we believe that. So that's his working definition of religion in The Will to Believe. The essay, herein is Life Worth Living, the second essay in this volume. He says religion is faith in the existence of an unseen order of some kind in which the riddles of the natural order may be found explained. Or the belief that the so-called order of nature, which constitutes this world's experience, is only one portion of the total universe, and that there stretches beyond this visible world an unseen world of which we now know nothing positive, but in its relation to which the true significance of our present mundane life consists. And of course, connections between these things may be made. The eternal things that are of the greater value in the definition from The Will to Believe are the things of this unseen world of which we now know nothing positive, but in relation to which the true significance of our present mundane life consists from this definition. Now, I'm skipping, half a paragraph or so. Now, I wish to make you feel, if I can, in the short remainder of this hour. Remember, he was giving this as a speech to, the Harvard Young Men's Christian Association in the 1890s. And he has 1 hour to deliver this spectacular piece of philosophy. Now, I wish to make you feel, if I can, in the short remainder of this hour, that we have a right to believe the physical order to be only a partial order, that we have a right to supplement it by an unseen spiritual order, which we assume on trust, if only thereby life may seem to us better worth living again. We have a right to believe in that higher order of things. We have a right to believe that the world we observe with our 5 senses, taste, sight, smell, hearing, touch, is only part of reality, that there is some reality beyond it that matters more, and that in reference to which the reality we observe with our senses is to be understood and evaluated. And we have a right to believe in this. We have a right to supplement that belief. We have a right to supplement, we have a right to believe that the physical world is supplemented by the higher world, if only by thus believing, life may seem to us better worth living again. So, there's a practical defense of the rationality of religious belief. If it makes life better for us, that is a major point in its favor. But as such trust will seem to some of you sadly mystical and execrably unscientific, I must first say a word or two to weaken the veto which you may consider that science opposes to our act. So, this seems like, wishful thinking. This seems like believing based on desire and not based on evidence, not based on experience. We ought to believe in what science has shown and not jump ahead of the evidence. Follow the evidence. Don't let your beliefs run ahead of the evidence. That's the the objection to religious belief, James must now consider. It has a veto on this, practically speaking, in many people's lives. This skeptical scientific attitude has a veto on religious belief. And James wants to override the veto, so to speak, with certain objections. Now, he's certainly not objecting to science as such. He's going to take what is a much more common approach in the philosophers of not saying that there's anything wrong with science as such, but that you have to understand exactly what it is, what is its subject matter, and whether it has anything to say about things that are outside of its subject matter. Let's go initially to a remark that could be compared to the other remark given in The Will to Believe. If we had time, we could look into this. I don't think we have time. Or at any rate, I don't feel like doing it, so I don't think I'm going to. But there's this fascinating remark in The Will to Believe about, here in this room, he's giving this in a university setting, we all of us believe in X, Y, and Z. He rattles off a list of things that everybody in American universities these days believes. And then he explains why we actually believe them. It's not based on our understanding of the logic and the evidence. It's based on the prestige of the opinions, etc., etc. It's a fascinating passage. It's back in the essay, The Will to Believe. Here's a passage that can be compared and contrasted. In this very university, we are in Is Life Worth Living? Section 4, paragraph 1, 2, 3, paragraph 3. In this very university, accordingly, I've heard more than one teacher say that all the fundamental conceptions of truth have already been found by science, and that the future has only the details of the picture to fill in. Here in this university, this is, again, he's talking to the Harvard Young Men's Christian Association. So, Harvard University. Here in Harvard University, 1890s, James has heard more than one teacher say that all the fundamental conceptions of truth have already been found by science. Science has already figured out all the basics of all truths. We just have to work in some of the details. And James says, but the slightest reflection on the real conditions will suffice to show how barbaric such notions are. This optimism about science is ridiculous. And I speculate that we might very appropriately now look back on this in the 1890s and say whether he perhaps is right. This is the 1890s we're talking about. Has science not made any significant progress since the 1890s? And what does that perhaps tell you about the idea, if someone were to suggest it now, that all the fundamental conceptions of truth have already been found by science? If someone were to suggest that today, does the last 100 years since the 1890s suggest that maybe in the next 100 years we'll make some more progress and maybe find out that where things were in the early 2000s, 2000 is referring to the century, not 2000 to 2010. It's January 2021 as I'm recording this video. I don't think it will air till 2022. 2020s. You don't think in the next 100 years we're not going to find another huge bunch of instances of scientific progress that would render such a claim, that would make such a claim seem rather silly if we made it now? The slightest reflection on the real conditions, back to the text, will suffice to show how barbaric such notions are. They show such a lack of scientific imagination that it is hard to see how one who is actively advancing any part of science can make a mistake so crude. Think how many absolutely new scientific conceptions have arisen in our own generation. How many new problems have been formulated that were never thought of before? And then cast an eye upon the brevity of science's career. Think of all the recent scientific progress. And then ask yourself, if in such a short time you've made this much progress, do you think we suddenly stopped? Do you think we're suddenly done? We've suddenly reached it? Is it credible that such a mushroom knowledge, that is a quickly expanding base of scientific knowledge, such a growth overnight as this, can represent more than the minutest glimpse of what the universe will readily prove to be when adequately understood? You think scientific knowledge has been expanding like this, such a short period of time, so much knowledge, so fast, and suddenly now in the 1890s it's going to stop? Suddenly we've figured it all out? No. And in fact, it continued for the next, 2022 when this video is being aired, presumably, 1890s to 2022, another 140 years or something, kept expanding. You think it's suddenly going to stop now in the 2020s? No. Our science is a drop, our ignorance a sea. Whatever else be certain, this at least is certain, that the world of our present natural knowledge is enveloped in a larger world of some sort, of whose residual properties we at present can frame no positive idea. This is before modern quantum physics. Now let's take stock of where we are, and then pause, and then let things continue in another video. There's just too much to talk about here. I spent too much time on this passage. James is giving an argument that life is worth living. It's meant to be something we could say in reasoning with a suicidal person. No, man, life is worth living. Here's why. And his ultimate appeal is going to be to religion. Now, the thing that causes this despair, he thinks, although it may have some biological causes as well, he's certainly optimistic that there are biological causes of depression. He thinks there is also an idea cause of depression, a conceptual cause of depression. Let me try to remind myself what was his actual word. There is for depression a reflective cause, and that cause is the conflict between the world as we observe it and the need to think that this world is expressing the will of some divinity. And one halfway house solution, as he describes it, or a poor halfway stage, as it may seem to be, as he describes in section 3, which we've not gone over in any detail in this video, but a halfway stage to recovery from this sort of depression is to just drop the religious aspect and just think about the facts on their own terms and find in that consideration some justification for life being worth living. And he thinks that can be done. But his major argument is now to return to this religious perspective and defend the religious perspective. Even in the case of all the evidence from human experience of a whole lot of suffering and evil and misery in this life, we are still justified in accepting that religious proposition. He's going to defend that. And what has he done to defend it so far that we've touched on in this video? So far, all he's done is point out that science has not yet discovered the whole of reality and is not likely to anytime soon, thus undermining one objection based on the idea that you should only believe what science has shown. Science is the only source of total knowledge of all the truths we ever want to know. No, it's not exactly like that. No, science hasn't even gotten that far. So that's a start. There's much more to say in defense of these religious instincts in later videos, later in the text. From Is Life Worth Living? An essay in The Will to Believe and Other Essays in Popular Philosophy by William James. He's been giving an argument that life is worth living, the sort of argument you could use to persuade not just any suicidal person. He admits, section 1, he admits that, no, section 2, early on in section 2, first paragraph of section 2, he confesses, frankly, that with perhaps the majority of suicidal people, his suggestions are impotent to deal. With the majority of suicidal people, perhaps his arguments are useless. But with the reflective sort, his arguments should be useful. He's trying to give the kind of argument you could give to a reflective suicidal person, that life is worth living. But it's also a fascinating defense of the rationality of religious belief, to be read in as a companion piece to The Will to Believe, the more famous essay. So he's analyzed despair and the idea that life is meaningless as having a sort of religious root. There's a biological cause of this depression, of course, he acknowledges this, but there's also a reflective cause. And the reflective cause is we want to view the world religiously as the expression of the will of some sort of God. But unfortunately, that religious impulse doesn't seem to match up with the facts. And so he's trying to defend our right to believe in, right to let this religious impulse have its way with us, or right for people to have their way in life guided in part by the religious impulse, in spite of these facts. And let's go to section 4, where he's making his main argument. So far in the text, he's not made the argument yet. He has just pointed out that science has its limitations. Agnostic positivism, of course, admits this principle theoretically in the most cordial terms, but insists that we must not turn it to any practical use. In other words, the scientifically minded skeptics who say you shouldn't believe anything science hasn't proven, especially these religious beliefs of yours. These people will admit that science still has not learned everything. Science still has much to learn. But then they'll insist that we not turn this insight to any practical use. Now, James says this is a safe enough position in abstracto, i.e., theoretically this is good. It's very safe, very appropriate to only follow the evidence in theory when you're only dealing with theories. If a thinker has no stake in the unknown needs, no vital... if a thinker has no stake in the unknown, no vital needs to live or languish according to what the unseen world contained, the philosophic neutrality and refusal to believe either one way or the other would be his wisest cue. Again, this has so much to do with what we talked about in The Will to Believe, the earlier essay in this volume. In merely theoretical questions, not believing anything is the best way to avoid error. Not believing anything the evidence is not demonstrated decisively is the right way the best way, and therefore the right way to avoid error. But in certain practical questions, where we must act because we must live, and where acting requires us to decide how to act, and therefore we must choose what we believe about what is the right way to live, these questions, we may have some need, we certainly have a justification, to decide not based on the evidence alone. Because if we decide based on the evidence alone, we'll have missed our chance to act accordingly. We'll have missed our chance to live according to whatever moral principles we have to choose to live by. Unfortunately, neutrality is not only inwardly difficult, it is also outwardly unrealizable, where our relations to an alternative are practical and vital. This is because, as the psychologists tell us, belief and doubt are living attitudes and involve conduct on our part. There's no separation of belief and life, belief and action. Our only way, for example, of doubting or refusing to believe that a certain thing is continuing to act as if it were not. To not decide on a question is to decide to go without... Well, let me rephrase this. To not decide on a theory is to decide to go without the theory. To have no opinion on whether a theory, say, God exists, is true, is to live practically as if it's false. This is, well, pretty much the only way. There's no alternative. To not have a theory by rejecting it and to not have a theory by not accepting it are both not having the theory. Skipping just a few words. And so if I must not believe that the world is divine, I can only express that refusal by declining ever to act distinctively as if it were so. If I'm not supposed to believe that there is a higher power behind, and managing the facts of this world in some way, if I'm supposed to not believe that, I can only not believe that by acting as if it's false. Which can only mean acting on certain critical occasions as if it were not so, or in an irreligious way. There are, you see, inevitable occasions in life when inaction is a kind of action, and must count as action, and when not to be for it is to be practically against, and in all such cases, strict and consistent neutrality is an unattainable thing. Practically speaking, neutrality on a question like God exists means the same thing as acting as if God does not exist. It means taking a side against the existence of God in your behavior. Acting as if God, failing to act as if God exists is largely the same thing as acting like God does not exist. This neutrality, then, is not really a viable position, at least not practically speaking. At least it's not a viable alternative to belief and disbelief. Is it not sheer dogmatic folly to say that our inner interests can have no real connection with the forces that the hidden world may contain? In other cases, divinations based on inner interests have proved prophetic enough. Take science itself. Without an imperious inner demand on our part for ideal logical and mathematical harmonies, we should never have attained to proving that such harmonies lie hidden between all the chinks and interstices of the crude natural world. There's so much here. Okay. I think maybe I'll just pause this section, summarize this section, and try to get to a place where I can stop and save the rest of the essay for subsequent videos. Is it not sheer dogmatic folly to say that our inner interests can have no real connection with the forces that the hidden world may contain? Remember, review if you need to, earlier passages in the text from previous paragraphs of section 4 here, in particular paragraph 3 of section 4, and probably the previous video, where he explains how there are limits to what science has learned, and it is a virtual certainty that scientific knowledge will continue to expand, and the world of our present natural knowledge is enveloped in a larger world of some sort whose residual properties we can at present can frame no positive idea. In other words, there's more to the world than science knows, and there's this this currently unseen, unknown reality science has not discovered, at least not yet. And isn't it possible that our inner interests, like that religious impulse, that desire many of us have to view the world as expressing the will of some divinity, isn't it possible that these inner interests may have some real connection with something in the hidden world, the world science has not or not yet discovered? And is it not sheer dogmatic folly to say that this is definitely not the case? Is it not sheer dogmatic folly, certainly not empiricism, but dogmatism, to say, even though we as yet have no idea what is the nature of reality that science has not yet discovered, even though we have no idea of it, we can tell you this much about it, that your human interest in viewing reality as expressing the will of God has nothing to do with all the reality we don't know that science has, at least until now, been closed off to. That has, at least until now, been closed off to science. There is reality that has, at least until now, been closed off to science, and we don't know anything about it because it's closed off. But we do know this: it'll certainly have nothing to do with your inner interests, including that religious impulse. Is it not sheer dogmatic folly to say that? At least to say that in advance? Maybe if more evidence should come in, we could conclude that. But why say that in advance? Especially since we have an urgent need now to decide how to live. And ergo, we have a right to decide based not on all the evidence that may yet come in someday, but is not available yet. We have to decide now. In other cases, divinations based on inner interests have proved prophetic enough. Science itself is the result. The success of science is itself the result of a human passion, an inner interest, a human impulse to believe that the world makes some kind of sense, an imperious inner demand on our part for ideological and mathematical harmonies. That impulse has been the driving force of science. Dang it, it worked. Turns out it worked. It turns out the human passion to believe in ideological and mathematical harmonies in the world outside our minds is justified. But that's not something we can simply say has been proven by science. No. It's what gave us science. It was that impulse to investigate the world on that assumption that gave us science. It was an as yet unjustified preference for seeing the world in a certain way. And it worked. But the people who did the work, showed that it worked, were not following the evidence. No, the evidence followed their faith in an ordered world. That's where we got science. And I'll finish up this paragraph and then pause for future videos. And if needs of ours outrun the visible universe, let's go back a sentence or two. 3. But the inner need of believing that this world of nature is a sign of something more spiritual and eternal than itself is just as strong and authoritative in those who feel it as the inner need of uniform laws of causation ever can be in a professionally scientific head. The toil of many generations has proved the latter need prophetic. The toil of many generations of scientists has proven prophetic the human desire to believe in causality and order in nature. Why may not the former one be prophetic too? Why may not the need to believe that the world expresses the will of a divinity? Why may not that belief also prove prophetic? It worked for science. Who's to say it won't work for religion? And don't tell me that you can't make that decision in advance. You have to wait for the evidence to come in, because by that standard, we wouldn't have science either. If needs of ours outrun the visible universe, why may not that be a sign that an invisible universe is there? What, in short, has authority to debar us from trusting our religious demands? What has authority to tell us not to trust our religious demands, to trust our religious impulse? Science, as such, assuredly has no authority, for she can only say what is, not what is not. Science can tell us what is, and we recall the passage in The Will to Believe where science tells us what is and not what should be. Science tells us what is, doesn't tell us what is not. And in particular, it tells us what is in this region of reality that we have access to, that we've been able to study and figure out how to study so far. It doesn't tell us about the other regions of reality that it hasn't been able to figure out yet. It can't. It doesn't know anything about them. So it has no authority to tell us what's not there in those regions where it has no ability to study anything. So far, we've just done some work to clear away some of the possible objections to religious belief. Let's see what we have in the remainder of the text in the next video along those lines. Let's see if we can wrap up Is Life Worth Living in The Will to Believe and Other Essays by William James. We are in section 4. And James says, our faculties of belief were not primarily given to us to make orthodoxies and heresies withal. They were given us to live by. And to trust our religious demands means first of all to live in the light of them, and to act as if the invisible world which they suggest were real. It is a fact of human nature that men can live and die by the help of a sort of faith that goes without a single dogma or definition. The bare assurance that this natural order is not ultimate but a mere sign or vision, the external staging of a many-storied universe in which spiritual forces have the last word and are eternal, this bare assurance is to such men enough to make life seem worth living in spite of every contrary presumption suggested by its circumstances on the natural plane. Our faculties of belief were primarily given to us not for constructing systems of orthodox belief and lists of beliefs we exclude from the list of permissible beliefs. Our faculties of human belief were given us to live by. The real purpose of our beliefs is to live by them. Belief has a practical goal. And we have here he phrases it, religious demands. We have a religious demand. We have a religious impulse, a religious need. Maybe not all of us, but many of us at least have this desire or need to see the world of our experiences as working out the will of God, working out the will of some divine plan. And the reason life seems not worth living to many people is because the idea of a world working out God's plan doesn't seem to be consistent with the world of our experiences, which are often quite miserable. And James is telling us we have the right to believe in that higher plan all the same. We have the right to this very basic definition of a religious belief, which works without religious dogmas. He's not interested in any particular religious orthodoxy. He's interested in the minimal religious claim here that this natural order is not ultimate, but a mere sign or vision, the external staging of a many-storied universe in which spiritual forces have the last word and are eternal. This mere religious claim. Okay, so our faculties of belief are given us to live by, and to trust in a religious belief means not just to think it in your head, but to live by it, to act on it. To have a religious belief is to act as if it were true. And James thinks we have a right to this religious belief, and it is moreover that which can restore our belief in the meaning of life if we've lost it. It is a sufficient grounds for thinking, and actually the best grounds for thinking, that life is worth living no matter what our sufferings. Probably to almost every one of us here, the most adverse life would seem well worth living if we only could be certain that our bravery and patience with it were terminating and eventuating and bearing fruit somewhere in an unseen spiritual world. But of course we are not certain. If we were certain that our sufferings in life, as long as we bear up well under them and perform our duties well in this life, if we could be sure that our sufferings in life were bearing fruit somewhere in an unseen spiritual world, we could endure them. But we're not sure. So what do we do? And James says, well, we have a right to believe that they are bearing fruit in an unseen spiritual world. Now let's rewind just a bit and keep in mind one of the reasons he seems to think we have such a right to believe. One of the central reasons is, in fact, just one paragraph back, and I think I went over this in the previous video. Is it not sheer dogmatic folly to say that our inner interests can have no real connection with the forces that the hidden world may contain? In other cases, divinations based on inner interests have proved prophetic enough to take science itself. He's using impressively religious language to describe our motives that lead to science. Science is itself the result of a divination and a prophecy in human nature. It's the human desire to believe, the human impulse to believe, the human need to believe, the human passion that tells us that there must be an order to the physical universe, such that we can understand it according to laws of physics and causality, ideological and mathematical harmonies, and so on. This is a human passion, this instinct to believe this, and that's the foundation of science. And dang it, it works. It turns out that this human passion is prophetic. And isn't it just sheer dogmatic folly, certainly not based on experience, certainly not an empirical claim, to say that the same sort of passion as applied to belief in some higher order than the mere physical world, the sort that can redeem our sufferings and make life worth living, even when we suffer greatly, is it not sheer folly, and it's certainly not empirical, to say that the same sort of passion applied to this higher belief in a higher reality might not itself also be prophetic? That's one reason we have a right to believe. But let's look at what else he says. Let's see what he adds to this in the text. Even the most adverse life would seem well worth living if we could be certain. Granting that we are not certain, does it not then follow that a bare trust in such a world is a fool's paradise? Well, we are free to trust at our own risks anything that is not impossible, that can bring analogies to bear in its behalf. There are some limits on what we have a right to believe. You must believe only in what is possible, and what you can bring analogies to bear in behalf of. Well, what about this religious hypothesis? Is it possible? Yes. Can we bring analogies to bear in its behalf? Yes. Is it the product of a passion like that passion by which we trust science, and which has proved itself prophetic? Yes. And let's look at one analogy we can bring to bear, and then see what else James says about this. Our dogs, for example, well, let's rewind just a bit, that the world of physics is probably not absolute, is likely, and our dogs, for example, are in our human life, but not of it. They witness hourly the outward body of events whose inner meaning cannot by any possible operation be revealed to their intelligence. Events in which they themselves often play the cardinal part. My terrier bites a teasing boy, for example, and the father demands damages. The dog may be present at every step of the negotiations and see the money paid without an inkling of what it all means, without a suspicion that it has anything to do with him, and he never can now in his natural dog's life. Dogs are part of the life of humans, and they see the outward form of it, but there's a whole lot going on that they don't know, even when they're involved in it. Now turn from this to the life of man, or humans. In the dog's life, we see the world invisible to him because we live in both worlds. In human life, although we only see our world, and his within it, the dog's within it, yet encompassing both these worlds, a still wider world may be theirs, unseen by us as our world is by him. There might be, as the life of a dog is contained within the life of humans, and the dog only sees part of it, but is part of a bigger world. Maybe there's a much bigger world outside of our lives, containing our lives. And why may we not believe in it? It's possible. This analogy goes to show how it's possible that the universe is constructed. And to believe in that world may be the most essential function that our lives in this world have to perform. We may have an obligation to believe it because, remember, what we're talking about is the higher reality that gives meaning to and brings redemption out of our sufferings. We're talking about the higher world that has the last word and is eternal. The bare assurance that this natural order is not ultimate but a mere sign or vision, the external staging of a many-storied universe in which spiritual forces have the last word and are eternal. This basic definition of the heart of the religious hypothesis is a belief in a higher world, to believe in which is the greatest purpose of a human life in this world. If it's true. If it's true. So we're only following our duties if we believe in it, if it's true. But is it true? Well, maybe it's true. But maybe, one now hears the positivist contemptuously claim, what use can a scientific life have for maybes? Well, James replies, the scientific life itself has much to do with maybes, and human life at large has everything to do with them. Not a victory is gained, not a deed of faithfulness or courage is done, except upon a maybe. Not a service, not a sally of generosity, not a scientific exploration or experiment or textbook that may not be a mistake. Everything in science depends on maybes. Most of human life depends on maybes. We're never really certain of anything beforehand. We're dealing with fallible knowledge all over the place, science and human life. It is only by risking our persons from one hour to another that we live at all. And this may be the final consideration I think this will then be the final consideration in defense of our right to believe that life is worth living on these religious grounds. Often enough, our faith beforehand in an uncertified result is the only thing that makes the result come true. Now, there are some things where there are some facts that only become facts because we believe them. Now, we are not surrendering to subjectivism, relativism. We're not saying that beliefs don't have to correspond to reality. It's very important that beliefs correspond to reality. What James is talking about is the idea that there are some regions of reality that are under the influence of our behavior, and that our behavior is under the influence of our beliefs. And so our beliefs about those regions of reality have some effect on those regions of reality, sometimes making the belief true. It is important to have beliefs fit the world. There's still an important distinction between true and false beliefs. James has certainly not abandoned that. He's saying that sometimes you need to make the world fit your belief, not vice versa. Take this example, and I think we'll come to this again in another video because he's going to use this example in another one of the essays in this book, but here's his brief version of it. Suppose, for instance, that you are climbing a mountain and have worked yourself into a position from which the only escape is by a terrible leap. Have faith that you can successfully make it, and your feet are nerved to its accomplishment. But mistrust yourself, and think of all the sweet things you have heard the scientists say of maybes, and you will hesitate so long that at last, all unstrung and trembling and launching yourself in a moment of despair, you roll into the abyss. In such a case, and it belongs to an enormous class, the part of wisdom as well as of courage is to believe what is in the line of your needs, for only by such belief is the need fulfilled. If you believe that you can't make the leap that will save your life when you've got lost in the mountains, hiking or something, if you believe that you cannot make it, that belief will probably make itself come true. If you believe that you can make the jump, that belief just might make itself come true. And if you just try to, fit your beliefs to the evidence and say, I don't know what to believe, you will end up with the practical result of rejecting the belief. Because we're stipulating that this is the sort of jump you can just barely make if you're able to do it. Hang on, let me check the text. Have faith that you can successfully make it and your feet are nerved to its accomplishment. A terrible leap. You have to imagine the circumstances of the thought experiment just right. It has to be a leap maybe you're physically capable of making, but you're not psychologically capable of making unless you believe that you can do it. So whether you can do it depends entirely on whether you believe you can do it. And it's a binary choice. In one technical sense of the term, there's three choices. Believe you can, believe you can't, or don't believe anything. But there's a binary choice here as well. The binary choice between believe you can or don't believe you can. Whether by believing you can't or not believing anything. Believe you can or don't. And one belief makes itself true. And the other makes that belief that you can do it false. Makes the belief that you can't do it true. You have to choose, not based on the evidence alone, but based on what is best. And the evidence comes after the fact. In such a case, it belongs to an enormous class. The part of wisdom as well as of courage is to believe what is in the line of your needs. Believe what you need to believe. Now, what if this higher reality that is this bigger world that the religious hypothesis states is real? What if this higher world is such that not only are we obligated to believe in it and act accordingly, but what if our needs, and remember belief has a practical purpose, what if our needs are met only by believing in it? And what if confirmation of its existence comes through belief? And what if perhaps some beliefs about it only become true because we believe it? Refuse to believe, and you shall indeed be right, for you shall irretrievably perish. But believe, and again you shall be right, for you shall save yourself. You make one or the other of two possible universes true by your trust or mistrust, both universes having been only maybes, in this particular, before you contributed your act. Now it appears to me that the question whether life is worth living is subject to conditions logically much like these. It does indeed depend on you, the liver. Referencing the dumb joke from earlier in the book. Earlier in the essay, it wasn't originally his book. Someone else had used the joke. Someone named Mr. Malik. Is life worth living? It depends on the liver. Playing on the pun between the liver, the bodily organ, and it depends on who's living. It does indeed depend on the liver. If you surrender to the nightmare view and crown the evil edifice, that is to say, the evil edifice of the sufferings you experience in life, crown that edifice by your own suicide, you have indeed made a picture totally black. But suppose, on the other hand, that instead of giving way to the nightmare view of life, you cling to it that this world is not the ultimatum. And you believe that life is worth living for all these reasons. And by believing, you're able to make life better. And perhaps contribute to your own small part to the outworking of the divine plan in this bigger world. That life is worth living, we can say, since that life is worth living, we can say, since it is what we make it from the moral point of view. Life is what we make of it, morally speaking. And that is why life is worth living. We could make it worth living. Our faith in the goodness of the world we see has verified itself by leaning on our faith in the unseen world. But will our faith in the unseen world similarly verify itself? Who knows? So, if you want to get technical, the belief in this higher reality doesn't create its own truth. But the belief, that belief in the higher reality makes life better in this world, can verify, can create its own truth and verify itself. Once more, it is a case of maybes. Once more, maybes are the essence of the situation. I confess that I do not see why the very existence of an invisible world may not, in part, depend on the personal response which any one of us may make to the religious appeal. But maybe some facts about the world, the greater world, do depend on whether we go along with it. Maybe God draws, maybe part of God's plan depends on us and our faithfulness. These, then, are my last words to you. Be not afraid of life. Believe that life is worth living, and your belief will help create the fact. The scientific proof that you are right may not be clear before the day of judgment is reached. But that's not a reason not to make a judgment now. You need to. And you are recommended to make the judgment that life is worth living. Because you need to. Because these religious grounds for it are possibly correct. And because the belief itself may be one of those things that can only be verified by believing it. And as he says in The Will to Believe, the essay earlier in this book, A logical rule which tells you not to believe that which doesn't have evidence yet is a rule which would tell you not to believe anything that can only be confirmed by believing it. And that means it's a rule that would tell you you are not allowed to believe certain truths if those truths exist. And James says that is an illogical rule.